In the fall of 1883, the whole of Harlan County, Kansas, was watching and waiting. The watching was quiet, the way watching always is in a place where distance swallows most sound, and people learn early to study a neighbor's smoke instead of asking questions. The waiting was patient. It had to be. A widow alone on 400 acres, 60 head of cattle, and a $3,000 note due to the Harlan County Savings and Agricultural Bank was not, in the common estimation of the valley, a woman who would hold. She would grieve through October, reckon with November, and by December she would ride into town and sign the papers Clement Hale already had drawn up on the corner of his desk. That was the general feeling. The valley had seen it before. The valley expected to see it again. What the valley had not fully accounted for was the woman herself. Brett Ford was 38 years old in October of 1883, and she had lived on that land for 14 of those years, which meant she had been through 7 hard winters, 2 drought summers, and 1 season so wet that the creek ran to the fence line and stayed there for 6 weeks. She had arrived as a young bride from eastern Missouri, uncertain of the plains and their enormous silences, and she had spent the first year simply learning what the land required. By the second year, she was no longer uncertain. By the 5th year, she was indispensable to the operation in ways her husband Amos acknowledged, not by saying so, but by leaving more decisions to her than he admitted. He was a good man, Amos Ford, steady and fair and quietly proud, and he had worked those 400 acres with the methodical devotion of someone who understood that the land did not owe him anything, and that every yield was a negotiation. He died of a fever in the 2nd week of October, 5 days after the first hard frost, and the valley had not even finished its mourning before the calculation began. If you have ever known a place like Harlan County in that era, you know how the arithmetic worked. A widow with a note meant a property likely to come loose. A property coming loose meant someone's chance to acquire it cheaply. There was nothing cruel in this reasoning exactly. It was the mathematics of scarcity applied to grief, and most of the men who performed it in their heads would have said they were simply being practical. Clement Hale was nothing if not practical. He ran the Harlan County Savings and Agricultural Bank from a building on the north side of the main street in the town of Delworth, a 2-story frame structure with a painted sign that had begun to peel along the bottom edge, though Clement would not have you notice that. He was 51, well-fed, and wore his authority in the way he occupied a room, spreading himself slightly wider than the space required. He had extended the note on the Ford property 3 years prior, when Amos had needed to expand the herd, and he had done so without much anxiety, because Amos was a known quantity. A widow was a different category in Clement's ledger. He rode out to the Ford place on the 18th of October, 8 days after Amos was buried on the hillside above the east pasture. He came in the mid-afternoon, which he judged a reasonable hour, not so early as to seem indecent, not so late as to suggest reluctance. Brett met him at the porch steps. She was wearing a coat over her work clothes, and she had clearly been out to the barn because there was hay in the cuffs of her sleeves. Clement took off his hat and offered his condolences, which he meant in the general way that a man means something he has said many times before. He told her the county had lost a fine rancher in Amos Ford, which was true. He told her the bank was aware of the difficulties a property of this size presented when managed without full resources, which was his way of beginning. He told her that if she wished to discuss her options regarding the note, he would of course be willing to consider an orderly arrangement, meaning a sale of the land and a settlement of the debt. And he said the word orderly the way a man says a word that does him the most flattery. Brett listened to all of it. She did not interrupt him. She stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing. And when he finished, she said that she appreciated him riding out and that she would be keeping the ranch and making her payments as scheduled, and that she hoped he had a safe ride back to Delworth. Clement put his hat back on. He tried once more, gently in the manner of a man who believes the other party has not fully understood him. He reminded her the first payment of $1,000 was due the following October, and she said she was aware of the terms, and she thanked him again, and the matter was closed. He rode back to Delworth in the late afternoon with the uneasy feeling of a man who had offered a reasonable thing and been turned down without anger or fanfare, which was somehow more disconcerting than being argued with. He told two men at the bank the next morning that he expected to see Brett Ford in his office before the year was out, and both men nodded, because it seemed the likely outcome. The valley settled in to watch. What followed through that winter was not dramatic in any way the valley could have narrated as a story. It was simply work, the kind that does not announce itself and does not produce any single event worth carrying to the feed store and repeating. Brett and her daughter Callie managed the herd through a November that dropped to 8 below zero and stayed there for 11 days. They hauled water from the creek before it froze over, broke ice with a hand axe every morning before dawn, and fed the cattle hay from a stack Amos had cut in late summer that was, by Brett's precise count, sufficient for 12 weeks if they stretched it. She stretched it to 14 by bringing the cattle into the lower pasture and letting them graze the dead grass down to the frozen ground on the mild days, which saved 2 weeks of hay and kept the herd at 60 head through to March, without a single loss. Callie was 16, and she did not fully understand what her mother was doing, or why, except that her mother was clearly doing it with intention, rising before first light and working past dark and keeping a ledger at the kitchen table after supper where she wrote down what the herd ate and what it cost and what the calving schedule would require in the spring. Callie did the morning water hauling without being asked twice. She learned to read the weather by watching the horses in the lower pen, because her mother had learned it that way from Amos and had shown her how to look. She was skeptical, in the way that a grieving 16-year-old is skeptical of anything that looks like a plan, because plans had not, in her recent experience, held up against what the world actually did. She did not say this aloud. She hauled water and watched her mother write in the ledger. Their neighbor Dorothea Wills came over twice a week through that winter, arriving before noon on Tuesdays and Fridays, with food she had prepared at her own place and which she carried in a covered tin pail on the back of a paint horse named after no one, because she had never found naming horses useful. Dorothea was 61, a widow herself of 12 years standing, and she had made the same quiet calculation that Clement Hale had made, but had arrived at the opposite conclusion, which was that Brett Ford was going to hold the ranch and that the sensible thing to do was be useful while it happened. She brought roasted meat and dried bean soup, and once in early December, a jar of blackberry preserves that had no practical function in the operation of the ranch, but that Callie ate over the course of 3 days as though it were medicine. Dorothea and Brett did not talk a great deal during those winter visits. They worked together more than they talked, Dorothea mending harness or sorting tack while Brett repaired the fence line records or calculated the spring calving dates from the herd book, and the conversation that happened was the practical kind, about which posts needed replacing before the thaw and whether the easternmost section of the fence had held through the hard freeze. It was Dorothea who noticed in February that Brett had lost weight and was not sleeping enough, and she said so in the plain way she said everything. Brett acknowledged it, agreed it was true, and continued writing in her ledger. Dorothea left an extra jar of preserves. Spring arrived in the first week of April, early enough to be a mercy, and the cattle came through in condition that surprised the 2 hands Brett hired on for calving season. Their names were Eli and Porter, brothers from a family that had worked the county for 2 generations, and they had heard, as everyone had heard, that the Ford widow was likely to sell before summer. They found, instead, a woman who knew which cows were due and in what order, who had already identified the two most likely to require assistance, and who had prepared the calving pen with fresh straw and a lantern hung at the right height. Eli, who was 23 and had some opinions, said nothing about any of this but revised a number of his assumptions quietly on his own time. The spring calving added 9 healthy animals to the herd. Brett sold 4 of them, kept 5, and cut and stacked hay through June and July with Eli and Porter's help, putting up enough to guarantee the herd's winter feed and producing a surplus she contracted to sell to a neighboring outfit at $4 a ton. The feed supplier in Delworth, a man named Garfield who ran an honest scale and kept his books in a clear hand, told Brett in late July that her hay was as well cured as anything he had handled that season. She thanked him and asked him to hold the payment until October so she could deliver it to the bank in a single sum. On the 3rd of October, 1884, Brett Ford walked into the Harlan County Savings and Agricultural Bank, asked for Clement Hale, and when she was brought to his office, she placed $1,000 on his desk in mixed currency and a bank draft and asked for a receipt. Clement counted it twice. He wrote out the receipt himself, which his clerk could have done. He said that this was noted and appreciated. He said nothing else. But as Brett left his office and walked through the front room of the bank, she was aware of the tellers watching her, and she did not adjust her pace or acknowledge their watching. She walked out into the October street, mounted her horse at the hitching rail, and rode back toward the ranch at the same pace she had ridden in. The valley, which had been watching all year, registered the payment as something between surprise and recalibration. The question was no longer whether she would sell. The question became whether she could hold through a second year. The summer of 1884, which had felt tentatively manageable in the first months, had been concealing a drought that declared itself fully in late August and ran hard through September, dropping the creek level by half and drying the east pasture to a pale, crumbling stubble by the time the calves were weaned. Brett had made her October payment before the drought's full weight was clear. But through the winter of 1884 into 1885, she watched the water levels with the careful attention of someone who understood that 60 cattle required water that the land was no longer reliably providing. She had attended the county feed supplier exchange in Delworth in November, which was a gathering she made every year, because it was the practical place to learn what others in the county were managing and what they needed. It was there that she learned the Pryor outfit, 40 miles to the southeast, had sunk a secondary well the previous spring that was running clean and deep, and that the Pryors had more water than their herd required. Their foreman, a quiet man named Vance, had mentioned it in passing, in the way that men at those gatherings mention things, half looking for something without asking for it directly. Brett rode out to the Pryor place in early December, 50 miles by the road she took, on a day that was cold enough to see her breath from the first hour. She arrived at the Pryor spread in the early afternoon, introduced herself to the ranch owner, a man named Russell Pryor, who was older than she had expected and more worn, and she told him what she needed. She told him she could offer him labor in the spring calving season in exchange for water access through the winter months, 3 days of 2 riders and herself for the duration of his calving, in exchange for an open gate on his east fence line, and the right to bring her cattle to the secondary well on a schedule she would arrange so as not to interfere with his own herd's rotation. Russell Pryor looked at her for a moment. He said he had heard of her, which she neither confirmed nor denied. He said the arrangement sounded workable, and he would want to shake on it and have something written down in 2 copies, one for each of them. She had expected this and had brought paper and a pen. They wrote the agreement at his kitchen table while his housekeeper brought coffee, and Brett rode the 50 miles home in the dark, arriving after midnight. Dorothea, who had been staying at the Ford place to watch Callie, was awake when she heard the horse in the yard and met Brett at the barn with a lantern and did not ask any questions until the horse was put up. Then Brett told her what was arranged, and Dorothea said good, and they went inside. The water arrangement held the herd through the dry stretch. By late spring of 1885, the drought had broken and the creek was running again at its normal level, and Brett delivered her 3 days of labor to the Pryor calving as promised, bringing Eli and herself and a third hand she had hired for the purpose. Russell Pryor sent a note afterward that said simply that the work had been well done and the offer stood for the following year if needed. Brett kept the note in the back of the herd book. That summer and the fall following it were the months Callie Ford began to understand something that she could not yet have put into words, but that she felt in the way you feel a change in the wind before it arrives. She watched her mother carry the ledger out to the porch in the evenings and work through figures with the particular quality of concentration that had no anxiety in it, only calculation. She watched her accept Dorothea's visits without the strained gratitude of someone who needed help and was embarrassed by it, and instead with the ease of two people who had established what they were to each other. She watched her mother ride out at first light on days when the herd needed moving and come back at dusk with hay in her coat and a clear account of what had been done. The skepticism Callie had carried since the autumn of 1883 did not disappear all at once. It thinned, the way ice thins in late March, until one day it was simply not there. The second payment of $1,000 was made in October of 1885, and the third and final payment of $1,000 was made in October of 1886. Brett Ford walked into Clement Hale's office on both occasions with the same mixed currency and bank draft, and Clement wrote out the receipts with increasing care, as though the act of writing them required more concentration the second time than the first. After the final payment, he said that the note was retired and the deed was clear, and he said it with a formality that was also, if you knew how to read Clement Hale, a kind of acknowledgement. Brett took the clear deed, placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, thanked him, and left. She smiled on the ride home. There was no one on the road to see it. If patience and competence were the only things required of her, the story would have ended there. The note retired, the herd intact, the 400 acres clear of debt, and the valley quietly revising its estimate of what a widow alone on the plains could manage. But there was still the night of the fence. The event that the valley later called the fence break had happened in the fall of 1884, between the first and second payment, which meant it came at the worst possible position in the sequence, when Brett had one payment made and two still ahead of her and a herd she could not afford to lose. The first hard freeze of that October set in on a Thursday evening, dropping fast and dry after a week of mild weather that had softened the ground along the creek wash. The fence line on the eastern boundary followed that wash for a quarter mile, and the posts along that stretch had been set 2 years prior in ground that the dry summer had eaten from below. When the freeze came in hard overnight, the ground shifted and 40 feet of fence line went down into the wash before dawn on Friday, taking a gap wide enough for the whole herd to find. Brett woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of the horses moving in the lower pen with the particular nervous energy that meant something was wrong in the pasture. She was dressed and outside before she had fully understood what she was looking at. And she understood it, standing at the pen gate with a lantern within 30 seconds. 60 head of cattle loose near a frozen creek wash in the dark, with a gap in the fence and nowhere they were supposed to go. She went back inside and woke Callie and told her to stay with the horses and keep them from the wash. Then she rode the half-mile to Dorothea's place at a pace that was as fast as the dark allowed, arrived at the door, and knocked twice in the way they had established between them for necessity. Dorothea was up and dressed in 8 minutes. What followed was a night that neither of them ever described in full to anyone, though pieces of it came out over the years in the way that hard nights do. An image here, a detail there, surfacing when the occasion required it. They worked by lantern light and by the cold gray that begins just before dawn, moving through the wash and the frozen grass, turning cattle back from the creek edge where the bank was undercut and the ice was thin and unreliable. 3 animals had already gone partway down the bank and stood confused in the dark with their legs in the shallow current. The water not deep enough to drown them, but cold enough to stiffen their movement and make driving them out a matter of patience and pressure rather than speed. Brett went in after them, the water over her boot tops, and Dorothea held the lantern and kept the rest of the herd from following. They lost a fence post to the creek when the bank gave way a second time, and they lost the feeling in Brett's feet for approximately 2 hours, and they lost the lantern glass when Dorothea set it on a rock and the thermal shock cracked it clean through, leaving them working by the half moon and the pale line of the horizon for the last hour before full dawn. What they did not lose was a single animal. All 60 head were accounted for by the time the sun was fully up and the gap in the fence had been closed with wire, and whatever posts could be driven into the frozen ground as a temporary repair. Callie came out from the house when the light was good enough to see the yard and found her mother and Dorothea sitting on the fence rail with their coats crusted at the hem with frost and creek mud, both of them too tired to move yet and too satisfied to hurry. Callie brought them coffee in tin cups, which was what there was, and stood beside them and looked at 60 cattle standing peacefully in the east pasture in the pale October morning and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the sight had not already said. She was careful about which threads to pull and which to let alone. That was the quality the land developed if you stayed long enough and paid attention. Dorothea stayed for 3 days after the fence break, helping with the permanent repairs and cooking at the Ford stove, while Brett slept for 12 hours straight on the second day. Something Callie had not seen her mother do once in the 14 months since Amos died. When Dorothea finally rode home on the third evening, she turned her paint horse at the edge of the yard and looked back at the house with its lamp in the window. And she thought that this was going to be all right in the specific and permanent sense of the phrase, not just this winter but the whole of it, which was not what she had been entirely certain of a year ago, though she would not have said so then. The 3 years between the final payment and the bank purchase were the settled years, and settled is not the same as easy. There were 2 more hard winters, one of them with ice storms that took 4 animals and required Brett to carry a debt of $200 to the feed supplier, through to spring and repay it before summer. There was a summer when the calving rate fell short of what she had projected, and she sold the surplus hay at a lower price than she had hoped, and the margin was thin enough to feel. There were the ordinary griefs of the work itself, the losses and repairs, and the machinery that broke at the worst times, and the stretches when the county market for beef was soft, and the numbers in the ledger were honest but not comfortable. Through all of it, she ran the ranch with a precision that came from knowing every acre of the 400 personally and understanding what each season required of each part of it. She knew which pasture needed to rest in any given summer. She knew how much hay the herd required per animal per week at different temperatures, because she had kept that record herself for 3 years and had the figures to consult. She knew the Pryor water agreement was good for another season if the drought came back, because Russell Pryor was a man who kept his word and had appreciated hers. By 1886, when she walked out of Clement Hale's bank with the deed clear and the note retired, she had also accumulated something she had not set out to accumulate, which was the particular trust of the other women landowners in the county who had watched what she had done and drawn their own conclusions. There were 8 of them she knew by name and had spoken with at the feed supplier exchanges, and at the county agricultural meetings that she had attended every year since Amos died, sitting in the back row and saying nothing until she had something specific to say. 3 of them were also widows, holding properties under conditions similar to hers in the first years. 2 were the wives of ranchers who had left for other work and ceded the day-to-day operation to women who had never officially been acknowledged as running the place. 1 had inherited land from her father directly and had spent 4 years establishing her right to it against a cousin who felt the inheritance had gone to the wrong branch of the family. They knew one another the way women in a hard county know one another. Not intimately, not always warmly, but accurately and with a clear understanding of what each one had managed. It was Dorothea who brought her the news about the bank in the spring of 1887. Dorothea's son-in-law worked at the county land office, which was one of those positions that received information in the course of its ordinary operation without anyone intending to provide it. And through him, Dorothea had learned that Hale's Bank was carrying notes on 3 large properties in the northern part of the county that were not performing, that 2 of its primary depositors had moved their accounts to a bank in Emporia the previous fall, and that its creditors were pressing. The word pressing came from Dorothea's son-in-law, who had used it to describe the letters arriving at the land office from parties holding collateral interests in the bank's operations. And Dorothea had relayed the word to Brett with the careful accuracy of someone who understood its significance. Brett listened to all of it. She thanked Dorothea, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she needed to write some letters. She wrote 7 letters over the course of the next 2 weeks, 1 to each of the women landowners she had been thinking of, and the letters were plain and specific. She named the bank, named its condition as she understood it from Dorothea's account, and proposed that if a sufficient number of them were willing to pool their resources, they might acquire it, reorganizing it as an institution that extended credit on terms that took into account how a ranch actually operated rather than how a banker imagined it operated. She did not overstate the opportunity or understate the risk. She said the capital required from each party and what each party's share would be, and what the governance arrangement would look like in broad terms, because she had worked through the arithmetic at the kitchen table, and the figures were honest. 5 of the 7 wrote back. 4 agreed to participate. 1 asked for more time and came around 6 weeks later after speaking with her own attorney in Wichita and receiving advice that the structure was sound. Brett incorporated their commitments quietly, spoke with a lawyer in Delworth named Marsh, who had handled her own deed work and who was, she had determined over the years, a man who gave his opinion without requiring you to agree with it, which was what she needed. The purchase offer was made in June of 1887. Clement Hale did not accept it immediately. He sat with it for 10 days, which Brett had expected, because Clement was a man who needed time to reconfigure a situation in his mind before he could operate within it. His attorney went back and forth with Marsh twice on terms that were, in the end, substantively unchanged from the original offer. And on a Thursday morning in July, Brett and her 5 partners arrived at Clement's Bank on Delworth's Main Street. Clement was standing at his own desk when they came in. He had the deed prepared, which was his gesture toward managing the situation rather than simply enduring it. He went through the formal transfer of the instrument in the language the law required, and when he handed the document across the desk to Brett Ford, he held it for just a moment before he released it, not long enough to constitute refusal, just long enough to register that the weight of what was happening had arrived in his hands before it left them. Brett took the deed. She looked at it for a moment, not reading it. She had already read it twice at Marsh's office, but simply acknowledging it the way you acknowledge the end of something that took a long time to finish. She folded it twice and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, the same pocket where the ranch deed had gone 11 months before. She thanked Clement Hale, and she meant it in a plain and genuine way, without the satisfaction of a person who has waited to use a moment against someone. He had done what his position required, and he had recognized, finally, what she had done. That was sufficient. She walked out through the bank's front room with her 5 partners, and the tellers watched from their cages, the same cages they had watched from when she delivered that first payment 3 years prior. And she did not adjust her pace or acknowledge the watching, same as before. She smiled on the ride home, same as before. Callie was 20 years old by then, and she was waiting at the ranch when Brett arrived, because Brett had told her that morning where she was going. They did not make a ceremony of it. Brett unsaddled her horse and put her up and told Callie how it had gone, and Callie listened, and then said she thought her father would have found it fitting, which was the truest thing she had said about her father in 4 years, and Brett agreed and let that sit between them for a moment before they went inside. The Harlan County Women's Agricultural and Savings Bank, which was the name they gave the institution after the reorganization, operated out of the same building on Delworth's Main Street with the peeling sign, which they repainted that fall. It extended credit to ranchers, farmers, and small property owners in the county on terms that required an honest accounting of the operation, rather than simply the appraised value of the land as collateral. It was not radical in any philosophical sense. It was practical, which was the highest compliment available in Harlan County, and the word went around the county in the way practical things do, without fanfare. Through the feed supplier exchanges and the agricultural meetings and the quiet talk at the post office on mail days, Clement Hale opened a smaller office on the south side of Delworth the following spring and extended insurance to ranchers through a company based in Topeka, which was a different kind of work than banking, but one he turned out to have a good hand for because he understood what ranchers were worried about losing. He and Brett were civil to each other for the rest of their lives in the manner of 2 people who have finished with one arrangement and have no need to relitigate it. The ranch ran well for another 22 years under Brett's hand, expanding to 460 acres when she purchased the adjacent 40 from a homesteader who needed to move east for a family situation in 1891, and the herd grew to a high of 90 head before she settled it back to 75, which was the number the land carried best through the dry years. Eli stayed on as her primary hand for 11 of those years, and then went north to Wyoming to start his own operation, and Brett wrote him a letter of reference that described exactly what he had done and what she had observed of his judgment, and he kept it. The bank was sold in 1905 to a larger institution based in Emporia that offered terms the consortium found acceptable. By that point, it had operated for 18 years, and 3 of the original 5 partners had passed on, and their shares had passed through their estates, and the sale was an orderly one, handled through Marsh's son-in-law, who had taken over the law practice. The proceeds were distributed according to the shares held and reported accurately to the county recorder. Brett Ford turned 60 in 1905, the same year the bank was sold, and she noted both events in the same ledger she'd been keeping since the winter of 1883, which was still legible, though the covers had been replaced twice. She had begun to teach Callie the herd book in earnest that year, not as an emergency measure, but as a preparation, the way you prepare a thing you care about for its own future. Callie had long since moved past skepticism into something much closer to the understanding that had driven her mother, and she took to the records with the same particular attention, and she and Brett worked through the calving seasons together with the ease of 2 people who had long since learned to read the same weather. Amos Ford's grave on the hillside above the east pasture had a fieldstone marker that Brett and Callie had placed there in the spring of 1884, when the ground was soft enough to set it properly, and she had planted prairie grass seed around it that same spring, and the grass had come in well and stayed. She went up to it on Sunday mornings when the weather allowed, not for any formal observance, but because it was a thing she had always done, a carrying of the week's account up the hill, and a quiet settling of it in a place that received such things without requiring them to be said aloud. It was not grief, not anymore. It was continuity. Dorothea Wills died in the winter of 1906 at 74, having outlasted 2 of her own children and remained on her property through the last years with the particular stubbornness of a woman who considered her house a reasonable place to die. Brett sat with her in the final week and brought food in a covered tin pail on the back of her horse and held the lamp for the doctor when he came. After the service in Delworth, Brett rode back to the Ford place in the late afternoon with the particular quality of quiet that comes after a long friendship is finished, a quiet that is not empty, but simply complete. Callie took over the full management of the ranch in 1909, when Brett's hands had stiffened enough in the cold to make the morning water work genuinely painful, and she ran it with a clear-eyed practicality that her mother recognized as her own, given back in a different voice. The herd was 70 head that year. The hay ground was well established. The fence line was in better condition than it had ever been, and the deed was clear of any encumbrance whatsoever, which was the state Brett had first achieved in 1886 and had maintained without interruption for 23 years. Brett Ford died in March of 1914 in the house she had shared with Amos, and then managed alone, and then shared with Callie in the second bedroom with the window that looked toward the east pasture and the hillside above it. She had told Callie the previous fall that she wanted to be placed beside Amos, which Callie had known without being told, and which she arranged with the same careful competence she brought to everything else. They placed her beside him in the spring when the ground was soft again, and set a fieldstone marker the same as his, and planted the same prairie grass seed around it, because there was no reason to change what had worked. The valley that had once waited for Brett Ford to sell was by 1914 a different place in certain material respects, with a rail spur connecting it to the main line, and a second mercantile on Delworth South Street, and a county agricultural station that had not existed in 1883. In other respects, it was recognizably the same, still prone to drought and hard freezes and the particular arithmetic of debt and distance that the plains exacted from everyone who stayed. It had, somewhere between 1883 and 1914, revised its estimate of Brett Ford completely, not in any ceremony, but in the accumulated way that a place revises things, through what it told its children about what had been done and who had done it. Callie Ford ran the ranch for 30 more years after her mother's death, carrying the herd book in the same style and keeping the hay ground in the same rotation and making her payments to the Emporia Bank on time without exception. She had 2 daughters, both of whom grew up on the 460 acres and learned the herd book before they learned much else, and one of them stayed on the land and the other went to teach school in a town to the north, which was a kind of continuation too. On clear mornings in May, when the prairie grass on the hillside was green and the valley below it was carrying the particular low light of early morning, Callie would sometimes ride up past the east pasture to the 2 markers on the hill, not for any formal purpose, but because it was a thing her mother had done, and that she had continued, as you continue the things that belong to a place and to the people who shaped it. She would sit her horse for a few minutes and look down at the valley and the house with its lamp still burning from the early morning work, and the cattle moving in the lower pasture, and the fence line running clean and tight to the east boundary where the creek wash was. Everything she could see had been held once, against a quiet valley's patient waiting, by a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and had found no reason to say so. If you have ever watched someone carry a thing the world said they would drop, you already know what that hillside carried. If this story found you, Tell us in the comments what you think kept her going when the watching was hardest, because we read what you write there and it matters. There are more stories like this one here, about the people the frontier underestimated and what they built in the valley's silence, and we hope you stay for them.